Marcus Thompson had always been trouble. At 23, he already had a reputation on the streets of East London that made shopkeepers lock their doors when they saw him coming. His broad shoulders and scarred knuckles told the story of countless fights, most of which he had won through sheer aggression and a complete disregard for consequences. On this particular Tuesday morning, Marcus woke up in his cramped apartment above the fish and chip shop with a splitting headache and an empty wallet. The previous night's gambling had not gone well, and now he owed money to people who didn't accept excuses. His girlfriend, Sarah, had left 3 angry voicemails about rent money, and his mother hadn't spoken to him in weeks after he'd stolen from her purse again. The frustration built up inside him like steam in a kettle. Marcus had always dealt with his problems the same way, by taking his anger out on someone else. He pulled on his usual uniform, torn jeans, a black hoodie with burn holes from cigarettes, and heavy boots that had seen more fights than a boxing ring. Walking down the high street, Marcus felt the familiar surge of power that came from seeing people step aside when they spotted him. A young mother pulled her child closer. An elderly man crossed the street. This was his neighborhood and everyone knew it. But today, even that small satisfaction wasn't enough to calm the storm brewing in his chest. He stopped outside the newsagent, where Mr. Patel was arranging newspapers. The old man had refused to sell Marcus cigarettes on credit last week, and the memory still stung. Marcus kicked a trash bin, sending it clattering across the pavement, just to watch Mr. Patel flinch. "Having a bad day, are we?" came a calm voice from behind him. Marcus spun around to see a man in an impeccable dark suit standing near a black car with tinted windows. The stranger looked to be in his 30s, with perfectly combed hair and shoes so polished they reflected the morning sun. There was something about his posture, straight-backed and alert, that suggested military training. "What's it to you?" Marcus snarled, immediately sizing up this well-dressed intruder to his territory. The man was smaller than Marcus, probably weighed 30 pounds less, and looked like he'd never thrown a punch in his life. Easy target. The stranger smiled politely. "Nothing at all. I was simply observing that you seem frustrated. Perhaps you should find a more constructive way to channel that energy." Marcus felt his face flush with anger. This posh boy was trying to lecture him, on his own street. The rage that had been simmering all morning suddenly boiled over. Without warning, he grabbed the front of the stranger's pristine suit jacket and shoved him back against the newsstand. "You think you're better than me?" Marcus spat, his face inches from the stranger's. "Coming round here in your fancy clothes, talking down to people." The man remained remarkably calm, his hands raised peacefully. "I apologize if I gave that impression. That wasn't my intention." But Marcus was beyond reason now. The polite response only made him angrier. He'd expected fear, maybe begging. Instead, this stranger was treating him like a child having a tantrum. The humiliation of it made his vision blur with rage. "I'll show you what happens to people who disrespect me in my neighborhood," Marcus growled, drawing back his right fist. His knuckles had split the skin of dozens of faces. One more wouldn't matter. As his arm cocked back, ready to deliver what he was sure would be a devastating blow, Marcus noticed something that should have made him pause. The stranger's eyes had changed. They were no longer polite and apologetic. Instead, they held the cold, calculating look of a predator who had just realized his prey was about to make a fatal mistake. But Marcus was too far gone to recognize the warning signs. His fist was already in motion, aimed directly at the stranger's face when everything changed in an instant that would alter the course of his life forever. The moment Marcus's fist flew toward the stranger's face, time seemed to slow down. What happened next defied everything Marcus thought he knew about fighting. The well-dressed man moved like liquid mercury, his body flowing around the incoming punch with impossible grace. In one fluid motion, the stranger stepped slightly to his left, caught Marcus's wrist mid-swing, and used the thug's own momentum against him. Before Marcus could even process what was happening, he found himself spun around and slammed face first into the brick wall of Mr. Patel's shop, with such force that dust rained down from the mortar. Pain exploded through Marcus's face as his nose made contact with the rough bricks. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth instantly, and stars danced across his vision. But the stranger wasn't finished. With Marcus pinned against the wall, the man's voice remained eerily calm as he spoke directly into the thug's ear. "I am Sergeant James Mitchell of Her Majesty's Coldstream Guards," he said quietly, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "And you have just made the most significant error of your short, pathetic life." Marcus tried to struggle, but found his arm twisted at an angle that sent lightning bolts of agony up to his shoulder. Any attempt to move made the pain worse. The stranger, Sergeant Mitchell, had him completely immobilized with what seemed like minimal effort. "You see," Mitchell continued in that same conversational tone, "I've just finished 18 months protecting members of the royal family. I've trained with the SAS, survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, and dealt with threats you couldn't imagine in your worst nightmares. And you thought you could intimidate me because I'm wearing a nice suit?" People were starting to gather on the street, but they kept their distance. Mr. Patel watched from his doorway, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Marcus's reputation for violence had made him the undisputed king of this small corner of London. But now everyone was watching him being handled like a child by a man half his size. Mitchell adjusted his grip, and Marcus felt his knees buckle, as pressure was applied to a nerve in his wrist he didn't even know existed. "The irony," Mitchell said, "is that I was simply waiting for my car to be serviced at the garage across the street. I had no interest in your little tantrum until you decided to make it my problem." Marcus tried to speak, to apologize, to beg, but all that came out was a strangled whimper. The taste of his own blood was making him nauseous, and the pain in his arm was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. This wasn't like the street fights he was used to, where size and aggression usually won the day. This was something else entirely. Precision, control, and years of training being applied with surgical efficiency. "I want you to understand something very clearly," Mitchell said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow seemed more threatening than any shout. "The people I normally deal with are international terrorists, assassins, and individuals who pose genuine threats to national security. You are none of those things. You are simply a small-time bully who thinks violence makes him important." With that, Mitchell released the pressure on Marcus's wrist just enough to spin him around. For a split second, Marcus thought he might be getting a reprieve. He was wrong. The sergeant's open palm struck him across the face with the speed and precision of a striking snake. The slap wasn't particularly hard by Marcus's standards. He'd taken much heavier hits in his street fights. But something about the technique, the exact placement, and the timing made his vision explode into white light. His legs gave way completely, and he crashed to the pavement like a felled tree. As he lay there, stunned and bleeding, Marcus became dimly aware of sirens in the distance. Someone had called the police. Through his blurred vision, he could see Mitchell straightening his tie and brushing dust off his suit as if nothing had happened. "The authorities are on their way," Mitchell observed calmly, checking his watch. "I suggest you use the next few minutes to reflect on your life choices, because they're about to become significantly more limited." As the police sirens grew louder, Marcus tried to push himself up from the concrete, but his body wasn't cooperating. His left arm hung useless at his side, shooting pain through his shoulder with every attempted movement. Blood dripped steadily from his broken nose, creating a small red puddle on the pavement beneath him. The crowd that had gathered was no longer the usual collection of intimidated neighbors who scattered whenever Marcus appeared. Instead, they watched with fascination as their neighborhood bully lay helpless on the ground, defeated by a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a business meeting. Mrs. Chen, who ran the corner shop and had been robbed by Marcus twice in the past year, stood in her doorway with her arms crossed and a satisfied smile on her weathered face. Young Tommy Morrison, whose lunch money Marcus had stolen just last week, peered around his mother's legs with wide eyes. The balance of power on this street had shifted in the space of 30 seconds, and everyone knew it. Sergeant Mitchell knelt down beside Marcus, his expression showing neither satisfaction nor cruelty, just the professional detachment of someone doing a job. He pulled out a pristine white handkerchief and offered it to the fallen thug. "For your nose," Mitchell said matter-of-factly. "You'll want to get that looked at properly. It's definitely broken." Marcus stared at the handkerchief through swollen eyes. unable to process the gesture. This man had just dismantled him with surgical precision, and now he was offering first aid? The disconnect made Marcus's already spinning head reel even more. Why? Marcus managed to croak through his split lips. Why didn't you just finish it? Mitchell tilted his head slightly, considering the question. Because I'm not you, he replied simply. I don't hurt people for pleasure, or to make myself feel important. You attacked me. I neutralized the threat. End of story. The police cars rounded the corner at that moment, their blue lights flashing against the shop windows. 2 constables got out of the first vehicle, followed by a sergeant from the second. Marcus recognized P.C. Williams, who had arrested him 3 times in the past 2 years. The officer's expression showed no surprise at seeing Marcus on the ground bleeding. What's the situation here? P.C. Williams asked, though his tone suggested he already had a good idea. Mitchell stood up and straightened his suit jacket once more. This gentleman attempted to assault me, he explained calmly. I defended myself using reasonable force. There are multiple witnesses who can confirm that I was attacked without provocation. P.C. Williams looked down at Marcus, then back at the immaculately dressed Mitchell. The size difference made the story seem impossible, but the evidence was right there on the pavement. Marcus's reputation for violence was well known to every police officer in the district, and seeing him laid low was like watching a myth collapse. Right, then, P.C. Williams said, pulling out his notebook. I'll need to take statements from everyone. Sir, may I see some identification? Mitchell reached into his jacket and produced a military ID card along with his driver's license. P.C. Williams examined them carefully, and his demeanor shifted noticeably when he read the details. Coldstream Guards? P.C. Williams asked, his voice carrying new respect. Active service? Recently returned from ceremonial duties, Mitchell confirmed. I was protecting members of the royal family until last month. I'm on leave while transitioning to a new assignment. Marcus felt the last of his strength drain away as he heard those words. He hadn't just picked a fight with some random businessman. He'd assaulted someone who was trained to protect the Queen herself. The magnitude of his mistake was finally beginning to sink in. As if to emphasize the point, P.C. Williams crouched down next to Marcus with a look that mixed disgust and pity. Marcus Thompson, you absolute muppet, he said, shaking his head. Do you have any idea what you've done? This man could have killed you with his bare hands if he'd wanted to. You're lucky he showed restraint. Marcus wanted to argue, to maintain some shred of his tough guy image, but the words wouldn't come. Every part of his body ached. His pride was in ruins, and the entire neighborhood was watching him being lectured like a child by a police officer who'd barely graduated from academy. More police officers arrived as word spread through the radio network. This wasn't just another street fight. It involved someone with high-level security clearance and military credentials. The scene was being treated with the seriousness of a national security incident. As Marcus was finally helped to his feet and placed in handcuffs, he caught sight of his reflection in the shop window. His face was a mess of blood and swelling. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who had discovered he wasn't nearly as tough as he thought he was. The police station interview room felt smaller than usual as Marcus sat across from Detective Inspector Sarah Davies. His broken nose had been reset at the hospital, held in place with white tape that made him look like a defeated boxer. His left arm was in a sling, and every breath sent sharp pains through his possibly cracked ribs. Davies had been dealing with Marcus for years, watching his escalation from petty theft to assault. She'd seen countless young men like him, angry, directionless, and convinced that violence was the answer to all their problems. But she'd never seen one look quite so thoroughly defeated. Well, Marcus, she began, opening a thick file that contained his extensive criminal record. This is quite the situation you've found yourself in. Assault on a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces, creating a public disturbance, and let's not forget the outstanding warrant for your failure to appear in court last month. Marcus stared at the table, unable to meet her eyes. The reality of his situation was becoming clearer with each passing hour. This wasn't like his previous arrests, where he could rely on witness intimidation or legal technicalities to avoid serious consequences. Too many people had seen what happened, and there was no disputing the facts. The interesting thing, D.I. Davies continued, is that Sergeant Mitchell could have pressed much more serious charges. Do you know what the penalty is for assaulting a member of the Royal Guard? We're talking about terrorism-related charges, threats to national security. You could be looking at 10 years or more. For the first time since arriving at the station, Marcus looked up. What do you mean, could have? D.I. Davies leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. Sergeant Mitchell has made a rather unusual request. Instead of pressing for the maximum charges, he's asked to speak with you privately. He seems to think there might be another way to handle this situation. Marcus couldn't hide his confusion. Nothing about this made sense. In his world, when someone had you at a disadvantage, they pressed it home. They didn't offer alternatives or second chances. Why would he want to talk to me? That's an excellent question, D.I. Davies replied. One I suspect you'll have to ask him yourself. But before that happens, I need you to understand something very clearly. This is not a negotiation. This is not you getting off easy because you're lucky. This is a trained professional who has dealt with real threats to national security, choosing to show mercy to someone who doesn't deserve it. 20 minutes later, Marcus found himself back in the interview room, but now Sergeant Mitchell sat across from him. The Royal Guard had changed from his suit into casual clothes, jeans and a simple blue shirt, but somehow still managed to look more put together than Marcus had ever felt in his entire life. How are you feeling? Mitchell asked, his tone carrying genuine concern rather than mockery. Marcus touched his bandaged nose gingerly. Like I got hit by a truck, he admitted. Why do you care? Mitchell was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. Because I used to be you, he said finally. Different circumstances, different place, but the same anger. The same feeling that the world owed me something, and the same willingness to take it out on anyone who crossed my path. The statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. This composed, professional man who had dismantled him so easily had once been like him? It seemed impossible. I grew up in Manchester, Mitchell continued. Council estate, single mother, father who disappeared when things got tough. By the time I was 16, I had been arrested 4 times for fighting. I thought violence was the only language people understood, the only way to get respect. Marcus found himself leaning forward despite himself. What changed? A judge gave me a choice, Mitchell replied. Prison or the army? I chose the army thinking it would be easier, that I could continue being the same person I'd always been, just with better training. I was wrong. The army didn't just teach me how to fight. It taught me why to fight and, more importantly, when not to fight. Mitchell reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. It showed him in full dress uniform, standing at attention, outside Buckingham Palace. But what struck Marcus wasn't the grandeur of the setting or the impressive uniform. It was the look in Mitchell's eyes. There was pride there, purpose, something Marcus had never seen in his own reflection. I've spent the last 8 years protecting people who matter, Mitchell said quietly. Prime ministers, foreign dignitaries, members of the royal family, people whose safety affects millions of others. And every day I remember where I came from and how easily I could have ended up in a cell instead of wearing this uniform. Marcus stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the polished soldier in the image with his own chaotic life. So, what are you saying? That I should join the army? Mitchell smiled slightly, the first genuine expression Marcus had seen from him. I'm saying you have a choice to make, just like I did. You can continue down the path you're on, which leads to prison, violence, and eventually an early grave. Or you can decide that maybe, just maybe, you're capable of something more. Marcus spent 3 days in custody while the paperwork was sorted out. 3 days of lying on a thin mattress in a cell that smelled of disinfectant and despair, replaying the conversation with Sergeant Mitchell over and over in his mind. The physical pain from his injuries was nothing compared to the mental anguish of confronting truths he'd spent years avoiding. On the morning of his release, Marcus discovered that Mitchell had been true to his word. Instead of the terrorism-related charges that could have destroyed his life completely, Marcus faced simple assault charges with a suspended sentence and 200 hours of community service. More importantly, Mitchell had arranged something unprecedented, a chance for Marcus to attend a military preparation course. "It's not a guarantee," D.I. Davies explained as she processed his release papers. "The course is run by former military personnel who work with at-risk youth. If you complete it successfully and if you can stay out of trouble for 6 months, there might be an opportunity to speak with an Army recruiter." "But Marcus," she paused, fixing him with a stern look, "this is your last chance. There won't be another one." Walking out of the police station, Marcus felt like a ghost returning to a world that had moved on without him. The neighborhood looked the same, but he saw it differently now. The boarded-up shops, the groups of young men hanging around with nothing to do, the general air of hopelessness. It all seemed like a trap he'd been living in without realizing. His first stop was his mother's house. She answered the door with red-rimmed eyes and immediately pulled him into a fierce hug that made his ribs ache. Margaret Thompson had spent 43 years watching her son make increasingly bad decisions, and the phone call from the police station had nearly broken her. "I thought you were dead," she whispered into his shoulder. "When they said you'd attacked a soldier, I thought this was it, that you'd finally gone too far." Marcus held his mother for the first time in months, feeling the weight of all the pain he'd caused her. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. And for once, he truly meant it. "I'm going to try to be better. I don't know if I can do it, but I'm going to try." Over the following weeks, Marcus began the community service that was part of his sentence. He was assigned to a program that helped maintain public spaces, cleaning parks, removing graffiti, repairing vandalized property. It was humbling work, especially when he found himself cleaning up damage he had caused in his previous life. The military preparation course started on a cold Monday morning in October. 20 young men, all with their own stories of violence, addiction, and wasted potential, gathered in a converted warehouse in South London. The instructors were all former military personnel who had seen combat in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflicts Marcus couldn't even pronounce. Sergeant Major Williams, a compact man with scars on his hands and a voice like gravel, addressed the group on the first day. "You lot think you're hard," he said, pacing in front of them like a caged lion. "You think you know what tough is because you've had a few fights, maybe spent some time inside. I'm here to tell you that you don't know the first thing about being hard." The next 4 hours were a revelation. Physical training that pushed Marcus beyond limits he didn't know he had. Discipline exercises that required him to follow orders without question or hesitation. Team-building activities that forced him to work with people he would normally have seen as enemies or competitors. By the end of the first week, half the group had dropped out. By the end of the second week, Marcus was questioning his own sanity for staying. His body ached in places he didn't know existed. His pride had been systematically dismantled, and he'd been humiliated more times than he could count. But something strange was happening. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus was part of something bigger than himself. The other young men in the course were going through the same transformation, and gradually they began to support each other instead of competing. When Tommy Clark, a former drug dealer from Liverpool, collapsed during a training exercise, Marcus was the first to help him up. When Marcus struggled with the academic portions of the course, Sarah Jenkins, whose brother had been killed in gang violence, spent her evenings helping him study. 3 months into the program, Sergeant Mitchell made an unexpected visit. Marcus was in the middle of a navigation exercise when he spotted the familiar figure watching from the sidelines. Their eyes met across the training ground, and Mitchell nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement that somehow meant more to Marcus than any praise he'd ever received. After the training session, Mitchell approached him. "How are you finding it?" he asked simply. Marcus looked down at his muddy uniform, his scraped hands, his boots that had walked more miles in the past month than in the previous year. "It's the hardest thing I've ever done," he admitted. "But I think I might actually be good at it." Mitchell smiled, the same genuine expression Marcus remembered from their conversation in the police station. "Good," he said, "because I've spoken to some people, and if you successfully complete this course, there might be an opportunity for something special, something that would give you a chance to serve your country in a way that very few people ever get to." 2 years later, Marcus Thompson stood at attention outside Windsor Castle, wearing the distinctive red tunic and bearskin hat of the Coldstream Guards. The transformation was so complete that people from his old neighborhood would have walked past him without recognition. Gone was the slouching, aggressive posture of the street thug. In its place stood a disciplined soldier whose bearing commanded respect rather than fear. The journey from that humiliating defeat outside Mr. Patel's shop to this moment had been the most challenging thing Marcus had ever undertaken. After completing the military preparation course with honors, he had enlisted in the British Army and been accepted into the Guards Division, an achievement that less than 1% of applicants ever managed. Basic training had been brutal. The instructors had pushed him harder than he thought possible, breaking down every bad habit and negative attitude he'd spent years building up. There were moments when he wanted to quit, to return to the familiar chaos of his old life. But each time he reached that breaking point, he thought about Sergeant Mitchell's words about choice, about purpose, about being capable of something more. Advanced training had been even more demanding. Learning to march in perfect synchronization, to handle weapons with absolute precision, to maintain composure under pressure that would have broken his former self. The attention to detail required was staggering. Uniforms had to be flawless, movements had to be exact, and any mistake was met with consequences that made his old street fights seem like playground scuffles. But the hardest part hadn't been the physical demands or the rigid discipline. The hardest part had been learning to trust his fellow soldiers completely, to put their safety above his own, to be part of something larger than his individual desires. For someone who had spent years looking out only for himself, this shift in mindset was revolutionary. Today marked a special occasion. Marcus was part of the ceremonial guard for a state visit, standing mere feet from members of the royal family as they greeted foreign dignitaries. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same hands that had once stolen from his mother's purse were now entrusted with protecting the crown. During a brief break between ceremonies, Marcus found a moment to reflect on the path that had brought him here. His mother had been in the crowd earlier, tears of pride streaming down her face as she watched her son perform duties that represented the highest honor his country could bestow. The woman who had once feared phone calls from the police now bragged to her neighbors about her boy in the Guards. The old neighborhood had changed too, though not always for the better. Tommy Morrison, the boy whose lunch money Marcus had once stolen, was now facing his own legal troubles for following in Marcus's old footsteps. Mrs. Chen's shop had been robbed again, this time by someone who made Marcus's former crimes look minor in comparison. The cycle of violence and despair continued, but Marcus was no longer part of it. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Impressive sight, isn't it?" Marcus turned to see Sergeant Mitchell approaching, now wearing the uniform of a captain. The man who had changed his life with a single moment of controlled violence had continued his own career progression, earning commendations for service that remained classified but had clearly impressed his superiors. "Captain Mitchell," Marcus said, snapping to attention. "I wasn't expecting to see you here, sir." Mitchell smiled and gestured for Marcus to relax. "I requested to be here today. I wanted to see how this story ended." He paused, studying Marcus, with approval. "Though I suppose it's not really ending, is it? It's just beginning." Marcus thought about that statement. In many ways, Mitchell was right. The angry young man who had thrown that first punch outside the newsagent was gone forever, replaced by someone he couldn't have imagined becoming, but the journey was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, still opportunities to serve, still chances to make a positive difference in the world. "I never thanked you properly," Marcus said quietly, "for what you did that day, for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself." Mitchell shook his head. "I didn't do anything except give you a choice. Everything that came after, the training, the discipline, the commitment to change, that was all you. I just showed you that there was another path available." As they spoke, A group of tourists walked past, admiring the pageantry of the changing of the guard. Among them was a young man who reminded Marcus painfully of his former self. Angry eyes, aggressive posture, looking for trouble wherever he could find it. For just a moment, Marcus considered whether this young man might benefit from the same kind of intervention that had saved his own life. But that was a story for another day. Right now, Marcus had duties to perform, responsibilities that he had earned through blood, sweat, and a willingness to become someone better than he had ever dreamed possible. The ceremony resumed, and Marcus took his position with precision that would have made Sergeant Major Williams proud. As he stood guard over people whose safety had been entrusted to him, Marcus reflected on the strange twists of fate that had led him here. One moment of violence had destroyed his old life. One act of mercy from a stranger had given him the chance to build a new one. In the end, the local thug who had once struck a royal guard had indeed lost his teeth in return, not just literally, but metaphorically. He had lost the bite of his old anger, his destructive habits, his wasted potential. In their place, he had gained something infinitely more valuable: purpose, honor, and the knowledge that even the most broken person can choose to become whole again.